So here is something that will mess with your head before we even get started. The most famous experiment in the history of psychology never actually happened. Not the way you were taught anyway. You know the story. Pavlov, dog, bell, saliva, everyone knows it. You probably learned it in high school, maybe saw it in a cartoon, maybe used it as a metaphor at some point in your life. Except Ivan Pavlov's own writings confirmed that bells did not work, like at all. A loud ringing handbell triggered way too many competing reactions in the dog's body. The sudden chaotic noise startled them, induced a biological stress response, and that actually brought the conditioning process to a complete halt. What he really used was a metronome, or a flashing light, or a tone from an organ, or in some cases mild electric shocks. So the bell is basically a total myth, a century-old game of telephone that somehow ended up in every textbook on Earth. In every intro psychology lecture, in every pop culture reference to behaviorism. It is one of the most pervasive scientific myths in modern history. And when you strip away that pop culture caricature of the drooling dog and the bell, you are left with something far more profound and honestly far more unsettling. Because the real story of Ivan Pavlov is not a cute story about training dogs. It is a comprehensive theory about how your brain gets wired, how personality forms, and how neuroses can be created deliberately, systematically, in a laboratory setting. If we got the one detail everyone knows completely wrong, what did we miss about everything else? A lot, as it turns out. To figure that out, I have been going deep into primary historical research, clinical psychiatric case studies from the early 20th century, modern neurobiology papers from Stanford and the University of Pittsburgh, and Pavlov's own translated works. And what I found is that the real literature is not a manual about training dogs. It is a blueprint for understanding how the human mind gets built and how it breaks. But before we even get to the dogs, there is a translation error sitting right at the foundation of everything, and it completely flips the premise of his research. Everyone who has taken a psychology class has heard the term conditioned reflex. But here is the thing, Pavlov never used that word. He wrote in Russian, and the specific term he coined actually translates to conditional reflex, not conditioned. Now I know what you are thinking, that sounds like academic semantics. Conditional, conditioned, basically the same thing, right? But the philosophical distinction between those two words is actually massive. Think about what the word conditioned implies. It sounds like a permanent state. Like conditioning your hair or conditioning leather, the process is over. The state is locked in. It sounds robotic and fixed and entirely past tense. You are conditioned, and that is your permanent reality. But conditional means something else entirely. Conditional implies a fluid, highly situation-dependent process. It means the reflex only exists under a very specific set of environmental conditions. If those external conditions shift even slightly, the internal behavior changes with them. Pavlov did not view the brain as a rigid machine where you press a button and get a guaranteed result forever. He saw it as an active, dynamic, constant negotiation between the organism and the chaotic world around it, which completely reframes how we should look at his entire life's work. And to truly grasp why a Russian scientist in the early 1900s became so obsessed with these highly fluid conditional reflexes, we have to look at the man before he ever stepped foot in a laboratory. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was born in 1849 in Ryazan, Russia, and his original career path had absolutely nothing to do with science or biology. He was destined for the priesthood. He grew up steeped in rigorous theological training, because both his father and his paternal grandfather were priests in the Russian Orthodox Church. It was simply expected that Ivan would carry on that generational legacy. His early life was incredibly tough. He was the eldest of 11 children, and 6 of his siblings died of infectious diseases during childhood. Death and biological fragility were basically ambient background noise in his world from the very beginning. Then, when he was 9 years old, he had a severe accident. He was climbing a fence and fell, landing on a brick pavement and suffering a serious traumatic head injury. That injury delayed his formal schooling by an entire year. And it is during that recovery period that we see the first real glimpse of the personality that would come to define his entire career. Forced to focus entirely on his physical and mental recovery, day after day, week after week, he developed this fierce, almost punishingly regimented discipline, a strict routine imposed by necessity. And that level of intense, unyielding routine became the defining characteristic of his entire life, and eventually of his laboratory practice. He eventually recovered, entered the Ryazan Theological Seminary, and seemed on track for the life everyone expected of him. But then the 1860s arrived, and the intellectual landscape of Russia was undergoing a massive seismic shift. Western scientific ideas were flooding in, and the young theology student got his hands on two books that changed everything. He read Charles Darwin, and then, more importantly for our story, he read a book by Ivan Sechenov called Reflexes of the Brain. That book flipped a switch in his head that never got flipped back. Sechenov's work was deeply controversial and totally revolutionary, because what it claimed was this: all brain activity, including the highest levels of conscious, voluntary human thought, was fundamentally reflexive and driven by external environmental stimuli. In other words, free will is an illusion. Every thought you have is just a biological reaction to something you saw or heard or felt. For a young theology student trained to believe in the divine mysteries of the immortal soul, encountering a strictly materialistic biological explanation of the mind was a complete paradigm shift. It shattered his worldview. So in 1869, Pavlov abandoned theology entirely. He walked away from the priesthood and enrolled to study natural science at the University of St. Petersburg, which absolutely infuriated his father. But Pavlov was all in. He went on to earn his medical degree and began establishing himself in the field of physiology. And this is where he introduced a methodological revolution that would change biological science forever. And by today's standards, it was incredibly crude. It basically involved vivisection on anesthetized animals. A physiologist would surgically open the animal, isolate a specific organ to observe its function, take their notes, and the experiment typically ended with the animal dying on the operating table. It is like trying to understand how a smartphone manages battery life by smashing the phone with a hammer, ripping out the motherboard and watching it short circuit. You are not seeing normal day-to-day operation. You are seeing a system in total crisis mode. Pavlov realized that acute experiments yielded deeply flawed, practically useless data. Because you were looking at an organism in a state of profound physiological shock, extreme trauma, and heavy pharmacological suppression from the anesthetics. The nervous system in that state behaves nothing like a nervous system in a healthy, waking animal. So he championed what was called the chronic experiment, leveraging his medical training in aseptic surgery, which was itself quite new at the time. He developed techniques to surgically create permanent fistulas, small refined openings from the dog's internal organs directly to the outside of its body, usually through the cheek or the abdomen. Then he allowed the animal to fully heal. The dogs in his lab were not dying on operating tables. They were just living their lives. They lived completely normal, healthy, energetic lives. They ran around the lab, interacted with the staff, ate normally. But because of those fistulas, Pavlov could observe the digestive system, the saliva, the gastric juices, day after day, year after year, in an organism that was fully awake and unanesthetized. He could finally watch a biological machine working in real time under completely normal conditions. But maintaining that kind of research environment required an immense operation. The historical records describe his laboratory at the Institute of Experimental Medicine as less of a clinic and more of a physiology factory. It was organized with ruthless industrial efficiency. Over his career, he employed at least 146 co-workers, including a notably high number of female researchers, which was exceptionally rare for the era. Everyone had a highly specific, repetitive task. And running a factory of that size is not cheap. You have to feed the dogs, pay the staff, buy surgical equipment. So here is one of the wildest details buried in the research on his life. To fund this massive operation, Pavlov's lab essentially moonlighted as a commercial pharmaceutical manufacturer. They collected canine gastric juice from the healthy dogs via the fistulas that had already been surgically created. The dogs would eat, their stomachs would naturally produce digestive acid, and the researchers would collect thousands of flagons of pure dog gastric juice every single year. And they bottled it and sold it. Across Europe, people were drinking dog gastric juice daily, as a commercial over-the-counter treatment for dyspepsia, which is severe indigestion. Now, I have to be honest, when I first came across this, I assumed it had to be some kind of secret side hustle, a grift to fund his real passion for psychology. But that is actually a modern bias we project onto him, because we know him as a psychologist. At that point in his life, Pavlov genuinely did not care about psychology. He actively despised it. He considered himself a strict physiologist, essentially a biological plumbing engineer, figuring out the mechanics of the stomach. So the sale of gastric juice was not a grift. It was a legitimate medical product of its time and an incredibly lucrative one. It increased the laboratory's operating budget by 70%. The man was literally funding his state-of-the-art research facility by selling dog stomach acid to wealthy Europeans with stomach aches. It is an incredible image, but it is also exactly what brings us to the turning point of our story. Because his initial work was entirely focused on the chemistry of digestion, and he was the undisputed master of it. He spent the years between 1890 and 1897 meticulously mapping the neural control of the digestive glands. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, completely by accident, he stumbled onto the architecture of the human mind. His work on digestion was so precise and groundbreaking that he won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904, becoming the first Russian scientist ever to receive that honor. But here is the part that gets lost in every textbook summary. That Nobel Prize had absolutely nothing to do with bells, metronomes, or conditioning. It was strictly for proving that the nervous system, specifically the vagus nerve, controlled the digestive process. And to prove it, he developed a surgical procedure called the Sham Feeding Experiment. The mechanics of this are fascinating and also slightly bizarre. Pavlov would take a healthy dog and surgically sever and divert its esophagus so that it opened to the outside of the neck. Now imagine you have a hungry dog. You put a bowl of meat in front of it. The dog eagerly eats, chews, and swallows. But because the esophagus has been diverted, the chewed meat simply falls out of the opening in the neck and drops right back into the bowl. The food never actually reaches the stomach or the digestive tract. And yet, the dog's stomach instantly began producing large quantities of gastric acid, exactly as if the food had arrived. The stomach was gearing up for a meal that was never coming. Pavlov had definitively proved that the physical, chemical presence of food in the stomach was not required to trigger the digestive process. What was triggering it was the brain, sending a command signal down the vagus nerve and initiating digestion based entirely on the sensory experience of chewing and tasting in the mouth. But because he was observing these dogs every single day in his Physiology Factory, an anomaly started appearing. A glitch in the system, and initially a deeply frustrating one. The dogs began producing gastric juices and drooling heavily before they even tasted any food. They would hear the distinct footsteps of a specific lab assistant coming down the hall, or catch a glimpse of the empty food bowl, and the saliva would start pouring out. Pavlov referred to these episodes with intense frustration as psychic secretions. Psychic secretions. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. But you have to remember who he was at that moment. He was a chemist trying to measure the exact physiological response to the chemical composition of meat powder, and here were his subjects, completely ruining his perfectly calibrated data by responding to the mere idea of meat powder. He tried to control the environment to stop them from anticipating the food. But the more he tried to stop it, the more he realized something important. This was not a glitch in the biology. This was the ultimate feature of the biology. Think about an organism in the wild, an animal that can anticipate its environment, that can physiologically prepare its stomach to digest a meal before the prey is even caught. It has a massive evolutionary advantage over an animal that only reacts once the food is physically in its throat. It is the difference between being proactive and reactive at a cellular level, and the profound methodological realization that followed was this. Human psychology, what philosophers had spent centuries calling the mysteries of the soul, was practically impossible to study objectively. You cannot measure a soul, but saliva, drops of gastric juice, those are cold, hard, measurable, objective physical metrics. He realized he could use the salivary gland as a perfectly measurable window into the completely invisible workings of the cerebral cortex, which sets the stage for one of the most dramatic moments in scientific history. It is 1903. The International Medical Congress is being held in Madrid, Spain. Pavlov is the keynote speaker. The audience is packed with the greatest medical minds of the era, all expecting this legendary Russian physiologist to deliver a highly technical masterclass. Instead, he steps up to the podium and delivers a groundbreaking, completely unexpected address on the psychic and physiological processes of learned behavior. He introduces the global scientific community to the concept of the conditional reflex. In a single speech, he permanently pivots his entire life's work from the stomach to the mind. The shock in that room must have been palpable. He essentially told a room full of gastroenterologists that he was now going to map the human soul using spit. It was met with profound skepticism, as you can imagine, but to Pavlov it was a totally logical continuum. Having proven that the brain possessed the physical architecture to forge temporary anticipatory neural connections based on environmental cues, he decided to spend the rest of his life mapping exactly how that architecture is built, how it is maintained, and how it can be systematically dismantled. So let's get into the actual mechanics of how he mapped that architecture, because this is where the myth of the bell really does a disservice to the meticulous nature of his work. He needed absolute, unwavering precision. A hand-rung bell is far too variable for rigorous science. The volume, the duration, the exact pitch, it changes every single time. And Pavlov despised variables. He wanted stimuli that could be measured down to the millimeter and the decibel. The research shows he used mechanical metronomes ticking at exact, unchanging intervals. He used electric shocks of precise voltage, industrial buzzers, rotating visual discs, and ascending organ tones where he could control the exact frequency of each note. To understand how he used these precise tools to map the brain, you need to understand the conditioning formula. In textbooks, it often reads like a confusing alphabet soup: UCS, UCR, CS, CR. But when you apply it to the real world, it reveals itself as an incredibly intuitive explanation. You always start with an unconditioned stimulus, the UCS. This is something that triggers a hardwired biological response in your body without any learning required whatsoever. You do not have to practice it. Your DNA just knows what to do. Meat powder placed directly on a dog's tongue is an unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response, the UCR, is the natural, automatic biological reaction to that stimulus. The dog drools. Nobody had to sit the dog down and teach it to salivate when it tastes meat. It is innate. It is an unconditioned biological truth. Then the researcher introduces a neutral stimulus into the environment, a metronome ticking at 120 beats per minute. Initially, when the metronome turns on, the dog might prick its ears up, maybe tilt its head. Pavlov called this the "what is it" reflex, which is simply the brain's natural orienting response to a novel sound. But crucially, the dog does not drool. The metronome is neutral. The conditioning process begins when you manipulate the timing. If you present that ticking metronome just seconds before the meat powder, and you repeat that sequence over and over again, the brain begins to recognize a pattern. The cortex makes a physical, chemical connection between the sound and the impending arrival of calories. And suddenly the metronome is no longer neutral. It becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the drooling that happens when the metronome ticks, even when there is no meat powder anywhere in the room, is now the conditioned response. What is truly beautiful about this formula is that it does not just apply to dogs in a Russian laboratory. It applies to almost all associative human learning. Think about the last time you got severe food poisoning. Imagine you go to a restaurant and eat a warm, perfectly cooked slice of pepperoni pizza. And later that night, you get violently ill because the cheese had been sitting out too long and grew harmful bacteria. Run that through Pavlov's formula. The bacteria in the food is the unconditioned stimulus, your body's natural violent reaction to purge that toxin. The nausea and sickness is the unconditioned response. But your brain is essentially an association machine, constantly scanning the environment for threats. It connects the biological sickness to the last distinct sensory experience you had. The smell, the texture, and the taste of that specific pepperoni pizza. The pizza, which your entire life had been a neutral or even a highly positive stimulus, suddenly becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now, months or even years later, just the thought or the faint smell of pepperoni pizza triggers a conditioned response of intense nausea. You did not consciously sit down and decide to hate pizza. Your nervous system forcefully rewired itself to protect you from what it perceived as a lethal threat. Your cortex built a new conditional reflex to help you survive. We see this exact same dynamic in natural ecosystems. Take the famous example of the stingrays at Stingray City in the Cayman Islands. The sound of a diesel boat engine historically meant absolutely nothing to a stingray. It was background noise, a purely neutral stimulus. But decades ago, local fishermen started anchoring at that specific sandbar to clean their daily catch, tossing fish scraps and guts over the side of the boat into the water. The fish scraps are the unconditioned stimulus, which triggered an unconditioned response. The stingrays, smelling the blood and scraps, swam over to eat. Over the course of years, the stingray nervous systems began to associate the low rumble of approaching boat engines with the imminent arrival of food. The engine sound transitioned into a conditioned stimulus. Now, the moment they hear an engine miles away, hundreds of normally solitary, reclusive stingrays eagerly swarm toward the boats, anticipating a meal before a single scrap of food has hit the water. And of course, if we are talking about conditioning, we have to mention the greatest pop culture demonstration of all time. The famous prank from the television show The Office, where Jim deliberately conditions Dwight. It is a flawless textbook demonstration of Pavlovian mechanics. Jim reboots his computer, which makes a very specific, distinct chime. That chime is the neutral stimulus. Immediately after the computer chimes, Jim turns around and offers Dwight a breath mint. The mint is the unconditioned stimulus. Dwight reaches out, takes it, and eats it, experiencing the innate salivation. That is the unconditioned response. Jim repeats this controlled sequence over and over for weeks. Chime, mint. Chime, mint, until one day Jim's computer chimes and Jim does absolutely nothing. He just stares at his screen, but Dwight automatically, without thinking, extends his hand across the desk, fully expecting the mint. And when he realizes what he is doing, he looks confused and remarks that his mouth suddenly tastes terrible. The computer chime has become the conditioned stimulus. Jim literally hacked his co-worker's nervous system. But to measure these exact responses scientifically, to get the math right, Pavlov needed an environment with zero outside interference. He knew that any random noise, a door slamming, a temperature drop, a strange smell, would create competing reflexes in the dog's brain and corrupt the data. So, in 1911, funded by a wealthy Russian philanthropic group called the Lenzov Society, he built something known as the Tower of Silence. The Tower of Silence was an absolute marvel of experimental control. It was a specially designed multi-story building featuring deeply sunken foundations filled with sand to absorb seismic vibrations. The experimental rooms had tightly sealed double doors, foot-thick soundproof walls packed with turf, and a moat of hair around the inner chambers to isolate acoustic waves. The researchers could not even be in the same room as the dog because the sound of their breathing or their heartbeat might trigger a reflex. So the dog was strapped into a harness in the silent room while the experimenter sat completely outside, observing through a system of periscopes, delivering stimuli and food using pneumatic tubes. Historical accounts describe it as looking like a submarine preparing for deep-sea battle. He required that terrifying level of isolation because he was not just observing behavior. He was measuring saliva down to the exact fractional drop. He was trying to map the flow of electrochemical energy across the surface of the brain. And to do that, he believed that all behavior was governed by two massive opposing physical forces in the cortex: excitation and inhibition. Excitation is what we have been talking about so far. It is the activation of a neural pathway. The metronome ticks, a physical wave of electrical excitation sweeps across the auditory cortex, connects to the salivary glands, and the dog drools. But Pavlov realized that inhibition, the brain's ability to slam the brakes and suppress a response, was just as vital, if not more vital, for an organism's survival. Without inhibition, our brains would fire continuously at every stimulus until we died of exhaustion. Inhibition is the active process of shutting down pathways that are no longer useful. It is not a passive absence of reaction. It is a forceful, energy-consuming biological act. Which raises a critical question. Let's say you spend a month training a dog to drool at a metronome. The reflex is locked in, but then you change the rules. You start playing the metronome over and over, but you never give the dog the meat powder. Eventually, the dog stops drooling. The behavior disappears. Did the dog simply forget the training? Did the neural connection literally degrade and get erased from the brain? Pavlov wanted to answer exactly that question, and what he proved was that the answer is absolutely not. The brain is not erasing the memory like a deleted computer file. It is actively suppressing it. Pavlov called this internal inhibition. The dog learns that the metronome no longer predicts the arrival of food. So when the metronome ticks, the excitatory signal still fires, but the cortex immediately generates a massive wave of inhibitory electrical energy to block that signal from reaching the salivary glands. The brain is working incredibly hard to suppress the reflex. The psychiatric research Pavlov later compiled actually draws a direct comparison to the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Hermann Ebbinghaus was an early psychologist who studied how humans forget meaningless information over time. The mathematical curve showing how the dog's saliva drops off during the extinction phase perfectly matches the logarithmic curve of human forgetting. But the undeniable proof that the neural connection is not erased, merely suppressed, is a phenomenon Pavlov called spontaneous recovery. Picture this. You take the dog whose response to the metronome has been completely extinguished. It has not drooled at that sound in days. You take it out of the tower of silence, give it a few days of rest, let it play and move freely. Then you put it back in the harness and play the metronome again. The dog immediately starts drooling. Perhaps not as heavily as the first time, but the response returns instantly, because the neural architecture was sitting there the whole time, lying dormant, waiting to see if the rules of the environment had changed back to the way they used to be. The memory was never gone. It was just being held back by a dam of inhibition. And this realization led Pavlov to a deeply unsettling conclusion. If you have an environment that perfectly controls a mind's development and you understand how to build and suppress these reflexes, what happens when you deliberately introduce an unsolvable contradiction into that environment? Can you take a perfectly healthy mind and break it? This is where his work moves from the physiology of learning into the dark territory of psychopathology. He discovered that he could reliably induce something he called experimental neurosis. He essentially proved that mental illness, or neurosis, was not always a genetic defect or a spiritual failing. It could be purely mechanical. It could be manufactured by a hostile environment. The story of the circle and the ellipse is one of the most dramatic experiments in the entire body of historical research on his work. Pavlov's team placed a dog in the Tower of Silence and trained it to perfectly differentiate between two shapes projected onto a screen. If the dog saw a glowing circle, it meant food was coming. The circle was the excitatory stimulus. The brain said, go. But if the dog saw an ellipse, a stretched oval shape, it meant no food would be delivered. That was the inhibitory stimulus. The brain said stop, suppress the response. The dog learned this perfectly over several weeks. It would drool eagerly at the circle and remain completely calm, relaxed, and dry-mouthed at the ellipse. But then the researchers started changing the geometry of the shapes. Day by day, very gradually, they made the circle slightly flatter and the ellipse slightly rounder. The two distinct shapes started to look more and more alike. Imagine the internal biological state of the dog at this point. The brain is suddenly plunged into a state of tense, unresolvable cognitive conflict. The dog looks at a shape somewhere between a circle and an oval. The cortex is simultaneously generating a massive excitatory wave. This looks like the circle, prepare to eat, and a massive inhibitory wave. This looks like the ellipse, suppress the response. Two enormous electrical forces rushing toward each other across the physical surface of the brain. And when the ellipse was altered so much that the ratio of its axes reached 8 to 9, making it practically indistinguishable from the true circle, the dog suffered a literal physical nervous breakdown. The clash between excitation and inhibition completely short-circuited the cortex. The dogs lost all their previously memorized training. They forgot which shape was which. But it was not just memory loss, their entire personalities fractured. Some dogs became hyper-excitable, violently barking, tearing at their harnesses, destroying lab equipment, while other dogs went the exact opposite direction, entering a state of severe catatonic stupor, simply falling asleep in the stand and refusing to move. Pavlov realized that what he was doing to these dogs in the artificial vacuum of the lab was the exact same mechanical process that traumatic environments inflict on human beings in the real world. So he began taking his theories out of the Physiology Factory and into human psychiatric clinics. He started observing patients suffering from severe psychological disorders, but instead of viewing them through the lens of Freudian psychoanalysis, which was enormously popular at the time, he viewed them entirely through the lens of cortical conflict, short circuits in the neural wiring. He studied one psychiatric patient suffering from severe catatonia. The man had lain perfectly still in a hospital bed for years, unable to move a single finger, completely unresponsive to pain, completely silent. But years later, when the man finally recovered enough to speak, he revealed something deeply disturbing to his doctors. He said he had been entirely conscious the whole time. He had heard and understood everything going on around him for years. He recognized the doctors. He understood their conversations. But he described it as an insuperable crushing weight holding his muscles back. He literally could not force his body to move. Pavlov analyzed this and identified it as protective inhibition. He theorized that the patient's brain, perhaps overwhelmed by severe psychological trauma or a massive clash of environmental signals, had deployed a sweeping total wave of inhibition across the motor cortex. It was not a defect, it was an extreme biological defense mechanism. The brain was shutting the muscular system down entirely to prevent the cortical cells from exhausting themselves and dying from overstimulation. There is another striking clinical case study from his psychiatric research that brings this even closer to everyday human experience. A woman came to Pavlov's clinic seeking help for severe anxiety and strange physical compulsions. When she arrived, she absolutely refused to sit on any furniture in the building. She brought her own wooden chair from home and would only sit on that specific chair. When Pavlov's clinical team investigated her personal history, they found the environmental root of the trauma. She had married a man who did not love her, who had openly married her purely for her family's money. Her in-laws were severely and continuously emotionally abusive. They constantly criticized her appearance, her behavior, and repeatedly told her in aggressive terms that she was not in her place. According to Pavlovian theory, they had conditioned her. The constant verbal abuse, specifically the repeated phrase that she was not in her place, paired with the hostile environment of their home, created a massive inhibitory focus in her brain associated with occupying space. Sitting in other people's furniture triggered an overwhelming biological anxiety response. The toxic environment had literally broken the architecture of her mind. But because Pavlov viewed this not as a permanent failing of her character, but as a mechanical, conditioned physical response, he believed it could be reverse-engineered and fixed. His team began using a technique we now call counter-conditioning. The idea that if a neurosis is just a learned neural connection, you can unlearn it by carefully and systematically pairing the trigger with a positive or neutral outcome. They were laying the exact foundational blueprint for what we today call exposure therapy. It is astonishing how modern his clinical approach truly was. And his theories were so mechanically powerful, so precise in explaining how human beings are shaped, broken, and remade by their environment, that they caught the attention of the ultimate social engineers of the 20th century, the newly formed Soviet Union. Now, before we go further, I want to be completely clear. What follows is strictly a factual account of the historical and ideological alignment between the science and the state, as laid out in the research. We are not taking sides. We are simply following the historical record. The remarkable irony is that Pavlov himself was notoriously and dangerously anti-communist. He openly criticized the Bolshevik regime. He boycotted their meetings and publicly denounced their methods to the foreign press. There is a famous statement he made in 1923, right after returning from a visit to the United States, where he publicly declared that for the kind of social experiment the Soviet government was conducting, he would not sacrifice a frog's hind legs. He was essentially daring them to arrest him. And yet, despite his vocal public opposition, Vladimir Lenin and the Marxist regime heavily funded his laboratory. They provided him with extraordinary supplies, specialized rations, and massive scientific staffs, even during periods of severe national famine and starvation. That seems like a staggering contradiction. Why would a totalitarian regime generously fund a scientist who openly and loudly despised their government? because Pavlov's science, regardless of his personal politics, provided the perfect objective biological justification for the Soviet political project. Marxism is a deeply materialistic philosophy. It argues that human nature is not fixed, not genetic, not divinely ordained. It argues that human behavior is entirely the product of the social and economic environment. And Pavlov's theory of conditional reflexes provided the exact physiological mechanism for that philosophy. If the human brain is fundamentally plastic, if personality, beliefs, and behavior are just a complex series of learned reflexes wired by the environment, then by perfectly controlling the environment, the state could engineer a new Soviet man. It was the ultimate nurture over nature argument, but now stamped with the authority of hard biological science. To make his theories fit this grand unified vision of behavior, Pavlov began labeling almost every complex human action as a reflex, and he had a tendency to stretch his definitions well beyond salivary glands. His peers noted this as a point of genuine contention. He classified basic curiosity as a biological reflex, calling it the "what is it" reflex. And somewhat ironically, given his own situation under Soviet rule, he coined something he called the freedom reflex. He observed that dogs would naturally struggle against confinement in their harnesses, and he argued this was not because they possessed a conscious philosophical desire for liberty. It was because every organism has a hardwired biological reflex to resist physical restraint in order to survive. But this tendency to reduce every complex, beautiful, or chaotic human and animal behavior down to a simple mechanical reflex faced serious pushback from other scientists and philosophers of his era. The neurologist and psychiatrist Kurt Goldstein was among the most prominent critics of the Pavlovian model. Goldstein argued that the simple reflex Pavlov was so obsessed with was, at its core, an illusion. Not because the saliva drops were not real, but because the reflex was an artifact created by the highly artificial, unnatural conditions of the laboratory. His argument was this: if you strap a dog into a restrictive harness, lock it inside a soundproof submarine room, surgically alter its throat, and reduce its entire world to a ticking metronome and meat powder, of course it looks like a simple input-output machine. You have stripped away all the complexity of life. You force the organism to behave mechanically by putting it in a mechanical environment. Goldstein's counter-argument was that in the real world, an organism is holistic. It interacts with a complex, chaotic, ever-changing environment. You cannot isolate a single sensory motor arc, like a metronome triggering a salivary gland, and claim you have explained the entire essence of a living being. To critics like Goldstein, Pavlov was committing what they called the fallacy of peripheralism, trying to explain the highest and most complex functions of the human mind by looking only at the most basic biological inputs and outputs at the periphery of the nervous system. But despite that profound philosophical pushback, the theory took over the world. It fundamentally altered psychology, neuroscience, psychiatry, and eventually advertising, politics, and warfare. Which brings us to a fascinating historical mystery that we have been circling around this entire episode. If Pavlov was using precisely calibrated metronomes, electric shocks, and ascending organ chords, how in the world did we end up with the myth of the bell? Why does every high school textbook feature a drawing of a drooling dog next to a hand-rung bell? We can trace that massive public misconception back to a very specific moment in 1925. A well-known and highly influential Soviet filmmaker named Vsevolod Pudovkin came to Pavlov's laboratory to shoot a documentary called Mechanics of the Brain. It was a silent film, and that is the key detail. Pudovkin wanted to show the process of conditioning to the masses in a way they could immediately grasp. But a silent film cannot convey the specific rhythmic ticking of a metronome, or the precise frequency of an organ chord, or the hum of an electric buzzer. So Pudovkin used the visual image of a bell to represent the conditioned stimulus. It was a cinematic shorthand, a visual metaphor that worked beautifully on screen to communicate the idea of a cue. A film director made a creative choice for the sake of his medium and accidentally rewrote scientific history. The film was shown to scientists, students, and the general public globally, That striking, simple visual of the dog, the bell, and the saliva stuck firmly in the cultural consciousness. It was easy to draw, easy to understand, and it was repeated in textbooks for a century, while the dense, highly technical original Russian texts were essentially lost to popular history. And from there, the Western field of behaviorism took the ball and ran with it. B.F. Skinner, arguably the most famous behaviorist in American history, built his entire career and his theories of operant conditioning on Pavlov's foundation, though he modified it heavily. Skinner transitioned the focus from Pavlov's stimulus pairing model, connecting the metronome with the food, to an operant stimulus response model. In Skinner's version, the animal learns that taking a voluntary action, like pressing a lever, results in a reward. It was a shift from passive association to active operation. Skinner also famously viewed the brain as a black box that did not need to be understood physically. He had no interest in cortical waves of excitation or the electrochemical architecture Pavlov spent his life trying to map. But he deeply revered Pavlov's rigorous methodology and his concept of environmental control. In fact, Skinner proudly kept a photograph of Pavlov hanging on the wall of his office at Harvard University for his entire career. Now, what I find genuinely thrilling about the modern neurobiology research coming out of places like Stanford and the University of Pittsburgh is where the science has arrived today. Because for decades, Pavlov's theory of temporary neural connections was just that, a theory. He could not actually see the neurons wiring together. He trusted the saliva, he trusted the data, but he could not see the machinery beneath it. Modern neuroscience can finally look inside that black box. What is physically happening in the microscopic architecture of the brain when you learn that a tone predicts a shock or that a ticking metronome predicts food? What does a conditional reflex actually look like under a microscope? Research at Stanford University has finally visualized this process. Scientists conducted studies looking at neural ensembles in the amygdala of mice. The amygdala is a region deep within the brain heavily involved in emotional processing, fear conditioning, and memory formation. It is where these deep associations are forged. The Stanford researchers used advanced fluorescent tagging and calcium imaging to watch individual neurons fire in real time while the mice were being conditioned. They played a neutral tone and mapped exactly which specific neurons lit up. Then they delivered a mild unconditioned shock and mapped the completely different set of neurons that lit up in response to the pain. What they found validates Pavlov's theories at a cellular level. As the animal was repeatedly conditioned, hearing the tone right before the shock, the researchers watched the physical pattern of neurons firing in response to the initially neutral tone begin to shapeshift. It started to resemble the exact pattern of neurons that fire in response to the shock itself. The brain was not simply associating two separate events. It was physically bridging the gap, merging the representations of the sound and the pain into a single unified neural architecture. It is physical, visual proof of exactly what Pavlov predicted a century ago with nothing but drops of saliva and a fistula. There is another remarkable modern study from the University of Pittsburgh that examines how different individuals interact with conditioned cues. The researchers studied animal behavior and divided their subjects into two distinct categories: goal trackers and sign trackers. Goal trackers are animals that, when they hear a conditioned cue such as a lever popping out or a light turning on, immediately run to the location where the food will be delivered and wait for it. They use the cue purely as informational data. The cue says food is coming, so they go and wait for the food. That is the logical, expected response. But sign trackers do something entirely bizarre and counterintuitive. They become obsessed with the cue itself. The Pittsburgh research notes that sign trackers will run over to the lever or the light and paw at it, gnaw on it, lick it, and interact with it frantically, completely ignoring the food bowl where the actual reward is being delivered. It is as if the cue, a neutral piece of metal or a flash of light, has physically become the reward itself. A profound and irrational shift in assigned value. The researchers wanted to know what biological mechanism causes some individuals to become logical goal trackers and others to become obsessively fixated sign trackers. To find out, they used a cutting-edge technique called optogenetics. Optogenetics works like this. Researchers genetically modify specific neurons in the brain so that those neurons can be turned on or off instantly, simply by shining a tiny laser light on them. It allows for precise, real-time control of the brain's chemistry with a level of accuracy that would have seemed like science fiction to Pavlov. The researchers focused on the ventral tegmental area, a part of the brain that produces dopamine. They discovered that sign-tracking behavior is heavily dependent on a massive release of dopamine at the exact millisecond the reward cue appears. When the researchers used the optogenetic lasers to turn off the dopamine neurons during training, the rats completely failed to develop sign-tracking behavior. They would not obsess over the lever. But turning off the dopamine had absolutely no effect on the goal trackers. They still learned perfectly well to go and wait by the food bowl. It proved that there are completely distinct neurobiological pathways in the brain for how we assign value to the things in our environment. Pavlov scratched the surface of these environmental associations with his saliva measurements and his tower of silence, and now we are finding the individual neurotransmitters that drive the entire machine. And hearing how rigid and mechanical these dopamine pathways are, it makes you wonder how Pavlov saw human beings, whether, beneath all his science, he genuinely viewed us as biological machines reacting to stimuli. If you look at how he lived his personal life, the answer is fairly clear. He absolutely treated himself and everyone around him like test subjects. He was an incredibly eccentric, intense human being. His personal life was governed by the exact same unyielding rules he applied to his dogs. He believed entirely in the power of habit and environmental routine. The story of the 1923 New York robbery perfectly encapsulates who this man was at his core. Pavlov is visiting the United States and finds himself at Grand Central Station in Manhattan. He is 73 years old at this point, traveling with his son Vladimir. It is the middle of July. He is wearing a light summer suit and carrying his entire travel fund for the trip, somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 in cash, which was a life-changing sum of money in 1923. And he has it jammed into a bulky wallet that is visibly, almost absurdly, bulging through the thin fabric of his summer jacket. He and his son are either just seated in the train car or in the process of boarding the New Haven train. The son turns his back for a moment to put their luggage on the overhead rack. Suddenly, three rough-looking men approach. One blocks the door. The other two jostle the elderly Pavlov, snatch the bulging wallet right out of his pocket, and vanish into the crowd. What is most revealing is Pavlov's reaction. He is not hysterical. He is not screaming for the police. He is perplexed, certainly, but after analyzing the situation, his ultimate conclusion regarding the theft of his entire travel fortune was simply this: one must not put temptation in the way of the needy. It is the ultimate expression of objective detachment. He viewed the muggers exactly the same way he viewed his dogs, as biological organisms responding predictably to environmental stimuli. You place a bulging wallet in front of an impoverished organism, you get a conditional reflex of theft. He could not even bring himself to be angry at them. His eccentricities extended deep into his family life as well. When his very first son died tragically in childhood, Pavlov reacted to the biological trauma by insisting that all of his future children be given names beginning with the letter V. Vladimir, Viktor, Vsevolod. It was an intense psychological conditioning he imposed on his own family tree, as if creating a ritual of consistency could hold the chaos of grief at bay. His punctuality was legendary. The man operated on a schedule so tight it would make a train conductor nervous. He famously declared that spending 3 minutes in a barber's chair was a complete waste of time, which likely explains why he grew such a famously luxurious, massive white beard. He simply refused to allocate the environmental time required to shave it. Before he died in 1936, he wrote a posthumous letter addressed to the Soviet youth, outlining what he believed were the ultimate keys to a successful life in science. It is a beautiful and revealing letter. He did not focus on brilliance or genius or divine inspiration. He highlighted modesty, the courage to always look at the data and say, "I am ignorant." He highlighted passion, noting that science demands a man's whole life. But above all else, he emphasized discipline. His exact translated words were consistency, consistency, and again, consistency. From a theology student destined for the priesthood to a scientist funding his laboratory by selling dog gastric juice to wealthy Europeans, to a Nobel laureate who rewired the entire field of human psychology, Ivan Pavlov forced the world to look at the mind not as a mystical, untouchable soul, but as an architectural structure, a biological machine that is constantly being built, broken, and rebuilt by the chaotic world around it. He proved that every single experience leaves a physical, chemical mark on our neurobiology. And that brings us back to something we talked about earlier in this episode, something I want you to sit with for a moment. Spontaneous recovery. The modern Stanford findings confirmed what Pavlov knew a century ago. The brain never truly returns to its original naive state after learning something. Extinction is not erasure. It is just your cortex working incredibly hard, spending massive amounts of biological energy to actively suppress a connection that is still physically there, still intact, still waiting. So if every association you have ever made has permanently altered your neural architecture, and if forgetting is just your brain holding back the tide, the question worth asking is this: what forgotten conditional reflexes from your own past are sitting dormant in your cortex right now, just waiting for the exact right trigger to reawaken? Next time you hear a particular sound or catch the faint smell of something specific and feel a sudden inexplicable shift in your mood, remember this: the map of your mind is written in invisible ink, but Pavlov spent his entire life building the lens to read it. That is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for spending this time diving deep into one of the most fascinating and genuinely misunderstood figures in the history of science. If this episode made you see your own habits, fears, or cravings slightly differently, then Ivan Pavlov did his job, and so did we. Until next time.